David never intended to face a giant. He's the eighth son of Jesse of Bethlehem. In our Finding Our Way series, David's way is pretty straightforward. Somebody has to stay home and tend the sheep, look after the farm. David's way of supporting the war effort then is to bring provisions to his brothers who are on the front lines. David's the bottom of the heap. Eighth son, not many prospects for his future, just some menial labor. Trotting the road to Bethlehem, to the valley of Elah and back, that's his path. David's journey takes a sharp detour when he hears the voice of Goliath. You heard the description of Goliath. He's a champion. Goliath's a proven winner, decked out in the finest military technology from his helmet to his spear. We're even told about the weight of his armor and his weaponry. And for days, Goliath stands deriding, belittling, slandering the army of Saul. Give me a man that we may fight together. The difference on this day, unlike the others, however, is that David hears it. Oh, it's not just the taunts of Goliath David hears. The call of God comes to David through some way, and David's life is turned upside down. And instead of quaking in fear like all the trained soldiers of Israel with their armor and spears and swords huddled together in their regiments, David says, this giant cannot insult, taunt, and demean the God of our armies. I'll take him. Sounds like a childish wish, like an underdog story. The innocent David, too naive of the risks before him. The caricature continues. David stands before Saul. The helmet falls into his eyes. The breastplate hangs to his knees. The sword's too heavy that he can barely lift it with his skinny shepherd arms. So disregarding the military procedure of the nation, David instead explains that his skill with a slingshot is all he needs because he has the Lord at his side. If he can fight off bears and lions, he can certainly defeat this giant. And with a pocket full of smooth stones, this is exactly what David does. It's a story of courage accompanied by the identifiable power of the Lord. A weak, naive shepherd taking down a giant champion warrior. You don't do that on your own. Walter Brueggemann tells us, Israel recites this story of Yahweh's rescue and others like it each time it wants to mobilize or draw near to that delivering power. This is a nation-forming story. It reminds the people to trust the God who carries them along on their journey. But it may be a bit more complex than it originally appears. In his book, David and Goliath, author Malcolm Gladwell explores this story more deeply, looking at other ancient histories and artifacts and geography. Gladwell notes that the threat and taunt of the giant, this is a fairly common means of battle in the ancient world. One-on-one combat was a way to avoid mass casualties and end warfare more efficiently. Amongst the armies, there were three types of soldiers. The cavalry were the armed men who rode on horseback or behind chariots pulled by horses. There was then the infantry, which were soldiers who wore the breastplates and the shields and carried the spears and the swords, foot soldiers. Based on the detailed description of Goliath, Goliath is a champion infantry soldier, very, very skilled in hand-to-hand combat. But there's a third kind of warrior in ancient armies, and that warrior is known as the slinger. Ancient histories and artwork talk about how slingers were able to take birds out of flight with the accuracy of the stones that they would throw. The speed of the rock hurled by the sling is faster than the fastest pitch that a Major League Baseball pitcher can throw. In the tactics of ancient warfare, the slingers are the most effective combatant of the infantry soldier because they can take out that soldier from a distance. David carries a sling. Now, he's not in the army. He is indeed a shepherd, but he has practiced and honed his skill and shows that he can use it here. David sees Goliath differently than than the other warriors of the army. He sees Goliath as a bully, a blowhard, and he sees a solution that will reduce Israel's casualties. Goliath stands there in his heavy armor. David approaches him with a sling and some rocks. Goliath can't even see what stands before him. Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? Goliath sees only the shepherd with the crook in his hand. And David retorts not by mocking back to Goliath, but by bravely proclaiming the power of the God who has detoured David onto this particular path. And so angered, the giant charges. David pulls out the sling and in a flash launches the stone with devastating speed and with pinpoint accuracy. And so this depth of understanding perhaps broadens how we see God's hand at work in this story. The traditional reading that you learn in Sunday school, there's nothing wrong with this particular reading, but it describes that David wins in this conflict because God supernaturally intervenes and somehow speeds up the stone beyond what David could do to strike and kill the Philistine warrior. But if we look instead at how the power of the slinger comes to face an infantry soldier, the power of God begins to be seen in David's discernment and in the imagination that God gives to David to face a deadly foe. No one else in the valley of Elah sees Goliath as anything but a champion warrior they have no chance of defeating. But they're also outfitted with swords and spears and shields. Takes an outsider. Takes a fresh perspective. Someone not too schooled in the art of war, but instead experienced in the protection of sheep in the flock. The power of God in the imagination can bring down the greatest of giants. André Trocmé was a Huguenot pastor in France. When the Germans took control of France in 1940 during World War II, the new government there, the occupying government, made sure that Nazi symbols and Nazi loyalty was promoted as part of national life. They began to round up Jewish people, sending them to work camps in France, and then later would begin to send them to the concentration camps. Trocmé was co-pastor with Edward Tice in the village of Les Chambon. The Sunday after France fell, the young minister said to his congregation, "Loving, forgiving, and doing good to our adversaries is our duty. Yet we must do this without giving up and without being cowardly. We shall resist whenever our adversaries demand of us obedience contrary to the orders of the gospel. We shall do so without fear, but also without pride and without hate." Contrary to the gospel. He might as well have said, we will not face this giant in our own glittering armor and with our own sword. We'll confront it with our slingshot. So using the school and the community as cover, Trocmé and the congregation began to harbor Jewish children in their homes who were under threat of being sent to the camps, protecting them from being rounded up by the Nazis. This was their alternative means of confounding the giant. And they didn't hide what they were doing. When the minister of youth from the Vichy government came to visit Les Chambon, the congregation presented him with a letter, and they said, "We feel obliged to tell you that there are among us a certain number of Jews, but we make no distinction between Jews and non-Jews. It is contrary to the gospel teaching." They're drawing on Paul writing to the Galatians. We use it as our assurance of pardon. There is no longer Jew or Greek. So this is not some sneak attack on Goliath. This is not some assassination attempt on the part of the church. They're walking squarely into the valley of Elah, but they're refusing to play by the warrior's rules. They will not meet fire with fire. Over the coming years, then, when a raid would be coming, the pastor would get a phone call so that they could be prepared. Or when the soldiers would come to search the community, they would take a long break at the coffee shop, giving the church members time to respond. Why'd that happen? Well, we have to know the shepherding backstory of the Huguenots. The Huguenots are French Calvinists, the first Protestants in the country of France during the 16th century Protestant Reformation. They had been persecuted by Roman Catholic king after king trying to get rid of them. But they would always flee, run away, hide, and continue to practice their faith together. Magda Trocmé, the wife of André, said, "The people in our village already knew what persecutions were. They talked often about their ancestors. Many years went by and they forgot, but when the Germans came, they remembered and were able to understand the persecution of the Jews better, perhaps, than people in other villages, for they had already had a kind of preparation. If I have successfully protected the flock from lions and bears, then surely I can take down this giant." The Vichy government knew they could never wipe out these people because they weren't intimidated by their tactics, and they weren't going to stay frozen on the opposite side of the valley. They walked headfirst by a gospel imperative out of care and concern for their neighbor. They were unwilling to lie to the authorities, and they had a resolve that could not be squelched by the power and violence of the ruler. André Trocmé and the people of Le Chambon never planned to take this courageous stand. They were not intending to take part in the fall of a giant, but their history, their skills, and their imagination that comes from God gave them the courage to step in, to take a detour on the journey, and that detour would ultimately define their lives. What giants are standing before us? Where are we trapped on one side of the valley of Elah, hearing the taunts and jeers, but clueless for how to confront the challenge before us? Paralysis is one option, to stay stuck with Saul and his soldiers. David is another. To examine our experiences, to trust our skill, to be gifted with God's imagination, with a way that can bring down a giant by refusing to play the giant's game. Don't run headfirst into death. Take the detour, the alternate route, the creative path. But that's where giants fall, and God's power is revealed time and time again. Amen.